made it clear he wants to see a permanent ceasefire, first to stop the killing, stop the bloodshed.
We need more people that are willing to stand in this moral storm. Yes. Will you stand up and hold up your light?
The polling that I've seen, that I trust, that I rely on, like Rasmussen, for example, shows the president has never been more popular and that his policies have never been more popular.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides. For those of you keeping track at home, it's day 99 of Trump administration, the sequel. And since most sequels draw a lot from the original, the themes often apply. Theme of immigration ran through the first Trump administration. It runs most definitely through the sequel. Today, the president signed an executive order targeting so-called sanctuary cities. Those are local jurisdictions that do not provide local law enforcement support to federal immigration enforcement. That's a topic that's going to continue. Let's listen.
It's quite simple. Obey the law, respect the law, and don't obstruct federal immigration officials and law enforcement officials when they are simply trying to remove public safety threats from our nation's communities.
Short-term Russian ceasefire. It could be a moment, might even be a pivotal moment in Russia's war against Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced his intention for a temporary stop in fighting just days after President Trump's one-on-one meeting in Rome with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Harvard versus Trump, the feud, it's been going on for a while now between the Ivy League school, the first university in America, and the White House, goes before a federal judge. And what's interesting about that is Harvard wants a declaration as soon as possible. What's at stake? Well, among other things, university independence and more than $2 billion in federal funds for Harvard. And back to work. Congress returns to Washington after a 2-week recess. President Trump met with House Speaker Mike Johnson to map out the future of his tax and spending legislation. I want to start tonight with Willie James Inman at the White House and Charlie D'Agata at the Pentagon. Charlie, so let's start with you at the Pentagon. So our audience has heard the term ceasefire for a couple of weeks. Is there anything more meaningful or perhaps important about Putin's request for a 3-day ceasefire than the ones we've heard talked about or proposed before?
Yeah, Major, there might be, but as you're kind of suggesting, you and I have seen ceasefires break down in a matter of hours, never mind days. So really, it's going to be up to the Kremlin to deliver in deed as well as word. During the last ceasefire over Easter, that was only 30 hours, and that was violated by both times. So it's really going to have to be a wait and see. Now, in terms of what does it mean, it can be seen as a positive step forward, or at least meant to look that way, because President Putin has called it a humanitarian gesture. But it might also be an attempt to, like a gesture of goodwill to the Trump administration, that Russia's willing to compromise, to bend, and importantly has the power to press the pause on fighting. Though they've already warned that if the Iranians continue to fight through the ceasefire period, they will return fire and respond in full. Russia and Putin have been personally the target of the Trump administration for the past week. So this might be about positioning, about maneuvering, and more of a message to the United States than a peace message to the people of Ukraine.
Willie James Inman, to you at the White House. As Charlie just indicated, the last couple of days have seen, at least on social media, and even through Caroline Levin, we heard just a moment ago, the White House press secretary, some sense of impatience with the Russian leadership about either the tempo or the tenor of negotiations to end this conflict.
Yeah, that's right, Major. The White House still maintains that they want that more permanent ceasefire. And you've seen the president grow more frustrated with Vladimir Putin. Of course, we saw last week when he posted on social media, said, "Vladimir, stop," using the Russian president's first name after that deadly attack from Russia on Kyiv. Now, of course, over the weekend we did see, and that you showed that image there, with President Trump meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine there in Rome on the sidelines of the Pope's funeral. That, of course, is the first face-to-face meeting these two men have had since that Oval Office blow-up. Now, following that meeting, the president aboard Air Force One, he gaggled with reporters, and he talked about the relationship between him and Zelensky, and he essentially said that the relationship was never bad. He called the meeting a nice meeting. But he also has taken time to criticize Russia, saying that he was very disappointed that missiles continued to fly after these conversations had already begun for Russia and Ukraine to come to some type of deal. So this White House, as you pointed out, growing more frustrated day by day that there hasn't been an agreement yet or a more permanent ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine.
And Charlie, back to you at the Pentagon, and it's always difficult to read the tea leaves, but there was a phone call between the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the Kremlin put out a very dry, I mean, almost arid in its dryness statement about what this call meant and laying down a long-term foundation for eventual negotiations. To read it, it didn't sound like anything soon was going to happen.
No, and it doesn't. And certainly Ukrainians are looking at it that way as well. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said today, look, we're willing to negotiate, but we need to hear or get a signal from Kyiv. And I can tell you what they're saying about the ceasefire right now. They're saying, look, why don't you do it now? Like, why are we waiting till May? They remind they've tried to adhere to a 30-day ceasefire. Remember, that was rejected by Russia. As for a lasting peace, once again, they know the mood music coming out of the White House. They're running out of patience. They know the Secretary of State has said this is a pivotal week. So the clock is ticking not just on Russia. They know the clock is ticking in Ukraine as well. And even though, I mean, the sticking point has been Crimea, as we've discussed, even though Zelensky has sort of a constitutional duty to insist on keeping Crimea, you know, there's a larger and sort of growing understanding Ukraine is going to have to give up some territory. And remember, Crimea fell to the Russians back in 2014, not in this latest round of fighting. So a lot of people are just coming to terms that may have to be the sacrificial lamb in any negotiations going forward.
Willie James Inman, back to you at the White House. On another topic, over the weekend, the president saw several polls, ours, and we'll get to the specific numbers of our CBS News polling momentarily, but several others showing him losing favor, approval ratings down, and leaning very aggressively today at the White House in anticipation of the 100th day tomorrow on immigration. One of the few places where the poll numbers for the president are still comparatively solid next to economy, inflation, and the like.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's no surprise that the White House started their week of talking about what they see as their successes with focusing on immigration. We saw a rare early morning briefing with the press secretary and Tom Homan, the border czar, where he essentially said, had a message for migrants who the White House says are here illegally. He says, you cannot hide from ICE. We're actively looking for you. And one of the things that they use to show some of the progress that they've made is these signs that you see behind me, the signs of and pictures of people who the White House says have allegedly committed crimes, were here illegally. So the White House has put a strong focus on immigration and talking about what they see as successes, part of this 100-day message that they've talked about time and time again. But tomorrow we'll perhaps see them focus on the economy. That's certainly something that the president has seen his poll numbers dip in recently.
From the North Lawn of the White House, Willie James Inman. At the Pentagon, Charlie D'Agata. Gentlemen, thank you both. Joined now by Scott McFarland here at the desk. Scott, let's talk about Harvard and the Trump administration. What happened in court today?
It was a quick hearing, but it's going to be a long fight ahead. Harvard and the administration seem to agree on one thing. They're ready to have this out in court in a bigger way in July. They're going to have this whole thing out. No preliminary injunctions, no temporary freezes. They want to have this battle a few months from now during the summer recess for college students. The argument here remains the same. The administration is trying to leverage Harvard, withholding federal funding, alleging any number of pieces of misconduct the administration doesn't like happening on that campus and with those leaders of that school. Harvard is making the argument that this is an overreach by the administration, an infringement on First Amendment rights, and they'd like to squarely knock this out.
There are federal laws that apply to civil rights protections, public safety protections. Harvard said, we'll be having to have that conversation. What you can't do, Trump administration, is get into all sorts of these other governance matters and withhold federal funds over these core governance issues. That's the legal fight ahead.
And Harvard seems confident in their position, saying, let's go ahead and do this in July. No need for temporary reprieves. And they're going to go without that money until they have it out in July. But this is also a proxy for other universities who could be under scrutiny and in the crosshairs in the months to come. An awful lot of people will watch that hearing in federal court in July.
Scott, you also have some original reporting. You have so much original reporting on federal grants to lots of programs dedicated to assisting victims of crime.
This is surprising in scope. The Trump administration has frozen funding, halted funding for more than 360 grant programs that help support initiatives for crime victims, violent crime victims, inner city crime, elder abuse, child abuse, trafficking, refugees, and also programs that try to prevent school violence, domestic violence, and hate crimes. The administration has sent memos to these organizations, which go from Oakland to New Jersey to Maryland to Memphis, saying that those programs no longer effectuate administration priorities. One of the programs that was on the chopping block is the National Center for Crime Victims, which runs a national crime victims hotline, which is called 16,000 times a year. When we first reported they were losing their money and the hotline was to shut down Friday, they got their money back. Other organizations can appeal, and we'll try to do the same.
Scott McFarland, as always, thank you, sir. I want to turn now to Caitlin Huey-Burns on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers are back, and Republicans have a fair amount of work to do in the coming weeks. And the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, met with the president about the contours, the roadmap for the tax and spending bill. Catch us up on that, Caitlin.
Hey, Major. Well, if you've been looking at these past 100 days of the Trump administration and wondering where is that other co-equal branch of government, what have they been doing? Well, now is the time for them to act, because as much as the president is doing through executive order and unilaterally, if he wants his main parts of his agenda to be enacted into law, it has to go through Congress. If he wants some of his big immigration programs funded, Congress has to sign off. So this big budget bill, going through this process called reconciliation, which means they only need Republicans to pass it, essentially, is starting to be written this week. A couple of weeks ago, they passed the broad framework of that bill. And remember how much wrangling was involved just to get a set of blueprints essentially passed through. This is where the hard part really begins. The various committees are tasked with writing the legislation about extending, perhaps making permanent, the president's tax cuts as he wants, introducing new tax policy, funding immigration, a bunch of other things on the president's to-do list is going to go through this Congress. Now, the leaders have all been meeting today. Johnson was at the White House earlier today, making sure they're on the same page. The president is very influential here. He's essentially the chief whip. You know, he can tell these members what they should do and has been whipping votes throughout this session so far. So he's going to be critical. And just a few minutes ago, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was up here on the Hill meeting with Republican leaders, also trying to work through this bill. So they've got a lot to do. But really, the headline is that over the next few weeks, Congress is really going to kind of be at center stage here, because the president's agenda is now really going to depend on them.
And Caitlin, as I understand it, the president has set a aspirational deadline for signing this of July 4th or thereabouts?
That's right. Memorial Day is a deadline the House wants. July 4th, the president has said sometime this summer may be more realistic at this point. The bottom line is that they want to get this done as soon as possible because, as you well know, once the summer hits and Congress goes on recess for well over a month, then you get into the fall and the midterms start to kind of pick up later, and the urgency of doing this kind of starts to fade away. And because they're doing this through the reconciliation process, they've got to do it now. They're working on the budget for this next fiscal year coming up. So this is really the time, and they want to move quickly because the more time they have, the more time they have to disagree and to introduce new problems. So the arm twisting is already beginning. They're starting to write legislation, and we'll see what they come up with.
Caitlin Huey-Burns on Capitol Hill. As always, thank you. Related to Congress, Virginia Congressman Jerry Connelly announced he will not run for re-election and will step down from his chairmanship of the House Oversight Committee ahead of his departure. The Virginia Democrat cited the return of his esophageal cancer, first diagnosed in late 2024, as the reason. Vladimir Putin today ordered a 3-day ceasefire in Russia's war with Ukraine, the one he set in motion. Could this be a starting point for a permanent peace? That's a very big question. We're going to try to find out the answer to that as best we can right here next on America Decides.
He thinks that he is increasingly frustrated with leaders of both countries. The president has made it clear he wants to see a permanent ceasefire, first, to stop the killing, stop the bloodshed.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. When Vladimir Putin ordered a ceasefire, President Trump in recent days has questioned the Russian president's desire for peace. I want to bring in John Alterman, who holds the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. John, always great to see you. Parse for my audience where you think things are and what President Trump is trying to do and how frustrated or not he actually is with Vladimir Putin.
I think the president is looking around the world for deals, for agreements, for conflicts that he can move forward. He's using Steve Witkoff and deploying him in conflict after conflict. A lot of these are very complicated files that people have worked on for years and years. Witkoff comes in, has the advantage of being a little bit of an eighth, has the disadvantage of not knowing the files. And the sense is, can the president get people off balance, make it look like there's urgency, make it look like there's a deal, and see what he can move forward in whatever order unfolds, whether it's Russia first, Iran first, Arab-Israeli first, some other issue. I think the president's looking to say, I'm a president who's willing to make a deal, come deal with me.
Right. You know and I know the Russians view these things very much over the long term and very much embedded in their own interests. They know why they invaded Ukraine. They know what they want to accomplish there. And they know what they're not willing to accept. And they're not, it doesn't appear to me, inclined to budge very much, even if Steve Witkoff shows up every other day and President Trump says, I want a deal as rapidly as possible. How do you evaluate where we actually are right now?
You know, I think the way the president engages internationally is in many ways the same way he engages domestically. He gets people off balance. He creates different kinds of incentives. People are surprised. He's much more comfortable with disorder and even chaos than most of the people he's dealing with, and that gives him an advantage. It gives him a secret weapon. The challenge is that for leaders of countries like Russia and Iran, they say, you know what, we've seen American presidents come and go. We're not worried about elections. We're not worried about the kinds of things you're worried about. And I think the danger is that the president comes across as impatient, the president comes across as rushed, and they can wait him out. For countries like Iran, they say, we're going to live with the consequences of this for decades.
Whatever the deal is, right.
Why would we make a deal when we're at a position of maximum weakness? I think for Putin, this is a huge legacy issue. For Trump, it's what he's doing for the next 15 minutes until he goes on to something else. And the danger is that it's everybody else's number one priority. How do you move the United States? And for us, it's number 3, it's number 8, it's number 12.
Let's talk about some of the underlying contours of what might be an agreement to end this war. Russia gets Crimea, but does it get any or most of the territory it has won since it invaded? That's a huge issue for the Ukrainians. It's a huge issue for Trump because if it looks as if Russia got everything, then what did he accomplish? Those kinds of granular parts are where this negotiation is going to live or die, isn't it?
And the other piece of this, of course, is if you're in Europe, this isn't an academic issue.
Not at all.
If you're in Europe, this is, okay, that's what Russia does now, but what does Russia do in a year or 2 years or 5 years?
Is its appetite whetted?
And for a lot of Europeans, there's tremendous alarm at recognizing Crimea or any other territorial gain. I'm not sure how that actually is going to work out. I've certainly spoken to Poles and others who are very, very concerned that there needs to be a much firmer line held. Whether Zelensky was able to bring the president over to his way of thinking, get him to think more creatively, I don't know. It still feels to me very uncertain where this goes. It even feels uncertain how much the president is going to decide this is something he needs to engage with, or he's going to say, you know what, they're not ready. I'm going to turn my attention to something else.
Would I be wrong very quickly, John, if I were to say either way, in the next year or two, and possibly for the next 5 or 6 years, European nations that were not spending as aggressively on defense will spend more aggressively on defense?
They will. The extent to which it's the hedge against American abandonment, to keep the United States more engaged, to change the focus of U.S. engagement, I think those are the questions. But there is no question Europeans have to rethink their security framework, and the perception that the United States is never going to be in the position it's been in for the last 75 years is the key driver of that.
John Alterman, always a pleasure, sir. Thanks so much. Major. Well, the White House was focused on immigration today. New CBS News polls show slightly dwindling support for how the president is handling that and other issues. We'll dig into the numbers right here next.
The golden age of America begins right now. America will soon be greater, stronger, and far more exceptional than ever before.
President Trump, January 20th, we all remember it. CBS News polling finds his approval rating, though, not so golden. Not dingy, but not as golden. It slipped. February 9th, 53% of the country approved of the job President Trump was doing. That number now stands 45%. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, your friend and mine, Anthony Salvanto, joins me now. Anthony, break us down where things stand, where they were, and what the trajectories might suggest about the future.
Hey there, Major. So, look, you want to compare a president, first and foremost, to what he promised to do in the campaign, right? That's the evaluative metric, especially early on at 100 days. Look, 6 in 10 Americans say, yeah, he is doing what he said he would do in the campaign. Now, there's differences on whether they like that or not. But, I want to point out, look at the strong number of people who voted for him, who say that he is doing what he promised in the campaign. And that explains the fact that, by and large, that base of support continues to approve. That's helping underpin those numbers. But the movement, Major, let me show you this. The movement on inflation is notable because it is down. It is his handling of inflation that is down. The movement has come from people who were kind of giving him a chance on the economy, hoping that his policies would make them financially better off, which many expected. But what we're seeing now is that more relatively say they think his policies are making them worse off as compared to better. And that sets up a bit of a disconnect between what was expected going in and what they're seeing now. And that's behind some of that movement, Major.
Anthony, among those who are supporters of President Trump, is there a way that we have detected in the data that they're willing to hang on, that they're not going to give up, and they're going to ride this out even though it looks a bit bumpy for them and for the president? Yeah, as usual, you ask just the right question there, Major. And it's not in the prompter, folks. I promise you that's not in the prompter. I just asked that question. And from the Great Minds file, I thought it was a really good question, too, because I asked it in the poll. And I said, how much time would you give? Is 100 days enough time to judge a president? And to answer your question, look at the number of Republicans, or more than 2/3, who say, no, it's not enough time. Look, they see big things going on. They see a lot of changes. Most Americans do. And they say it's not enough time to evaluate it. Now, Democrats, by and large, they say they've seen what they seem to need to see at this point. And a lot of them say that they're frustrated by the way their party is handling the new administration. But Republicans, by and large, are saying, give it more time. Anthony, very quickly, immigration. What do we know? Immigration deportation program continues to get approval, but there is a bit of a difference in the principle that maybe they see in the program, but then the application. There's one of these points here. Many people saying it's not acceptable if, as a result of the program, legal U.S. residents are mistakenly either detained or deported. So it's in principle versus in practice that you see a little bit of that disconnect, Major. Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much. I want to bring in our reporter panel. Megan Messerly is a White House reporter for Politico. Tyler Pager, White House correspondent for the New York Times. Great to have you both. Thanks for being here. I'm sure this caught your eye. It certainly caught mine. President Trump's interview with The Atlantic, where he contrasts the first term and the second term. And let me quote him directly. The second time, I run the country and the world. Yeah, wow. Okay, that's not just aspirational. That's like declaratory. Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that in his tariff policy, right? The sense that, he believes that America has
He may
been
run the world, but not
off.
the bond markets.
Not the bond markets, no. We found that's the one pain point that he is willing to respond to. But I think we've seen in that, right? He really, truly believes that U.S. has been taken advantage of by the rest of the world, and he is now exerting his power. It was striking display when he was, at the Vatican over the weekend with all of these world leaders who he is currently putting a lot of pressure on right now with tariffs. And it's really just, I think it gets to the heart of that idea that he really does believe he's the one in charge and runs the world.
And Tyler, our numbers are down, not as far down as some other polls, but they're all relatively consistent, showing the same trajectory. Less approval of the president overall, less confidence in his current handling of the economy, unease about tariffs, that's putting it mildly. Those pollsters aren't wrong. They're all capturing something. They shouldn't be investigated. They shouldn't be put in jail, though the president intimated as much on social media. Where do you think the president and the White House feel they are at 100 days with these poll numbers?
Yeah, I think it depends who you're asking and who you're talking to, right? Obviously, President Trump always has a very rosy view of things, has basically declared the first 100 days an unabashed success.
Correct.
But I think when you look a little bit deeper into the poll numbers, as you were just, asking Anthony to do, there are clear signs of eroding support. And I think it's also indicative of the highly divided country that we live in and the partisanship that continues to sort of govern the day. I think one of the things that we've heard from some Trump advisors is concerned particularly about the economy. No surprise there. The economy often drives how people decide their vote. And that was one of the big weaknesses for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Democrats more broadly. Now, as we hurtle towards the midterms, obviously still more than a year away, we're starting to see some Republicans raise concerns about the tariffs and the impact on their constituents. And I think it's only going to get worse as the market tries to adapt to these price increases. And the president, has this sort of unclear policy of exactly what he's going to do, the whiplash. One of the things the markets want, investors want, is some sort of stability. And the president has not really given that. And so I think that's the pain point that we're seeing across the board, and particularly as you look at independents who were willing to give Trump more of a longer leash on the economy are frustrated by the policy so far.
And Megan, look, the Biden White House ran into this. They talked about inflation in their way. Voters and American consumers interpreted inflation their way. And when the opportunity arose to offer a verdict on their level of satisfaction with what the White House was saying under Biden about inflation and what they were experiencing, they rendered that verdict, leading us to President Trump 2.0.
Exactly.
We're not at that stage at 100 days or 99 days of that level of verdict. But there is, it seems to me, a risk factor here for the White House to describe something that even your own base supporters aren't quite yet experiencing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the big challenges that we've seen is the administration as they try to argue, we are doing well right now. Look at the investments that are coming into this country. Look at all this future success we're going to have. The problem is that people aren't seeing that today, right? They aren't seeing that when they go to the grocery store, when they are purchasing items. And that's exactly, to your point, the problem that Biden ran into. This idea that, you can tell people that by all these economic measures, however you want to slice and dice it, that things are going well. But if they're actually not feeling that at home in their household budgets, when they're living their day-to-day lives, that's going to be a problem. And that's really what we're running into. And you've had the president say, you just need to wait. Just trust me. We'll see the impact of these tariffs and these investments, and they're going to pay off in the long term as we have all this job creation and reshoring, though, with some of these deals, it's unclear exactly what direction we're going, right? Are we trying to raise a bunch of revenue from tariffs, or is the goal really to make these deals with other countries? And I think that's the problem right now is that, American voters are giving him a little bit of leeway, his own base, more so than other folks. But at some point, they're going to need to see some progress.
And Tyler, immigration is a clear area of emphasis, not just in rhetoric, not just in the visuals that we talked about earlier in this program on the North Lawn of the White House, but in terms of policy. And our own polling data shows a little bit of emerging ambivalence when it comes to U.S. citizens. And over the weekend, we had children born in this country who have citizenship status removed with their undocumented mothers. Do you interpret, and does the White House interpret that it's pushing up against anything there with this maximalist application of available federal immigration laws?
Look, I think when you talk about immigration policy, it really comes down to two key people here, and that's Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. And they have shown no interest in moderating the policy or positions at this point. I do think, to your point, that Americans are capturing some of the nuance that Democrats are really trying to drive home a point about, which is that there needs to be due process and protections for people that are legal permanent residents, that are citizens, all of that. And so I think that is something that Democrats we've seen really really try to hone in on is this idea that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach and you can just pick people up and send them out of the country. It does not seem that that is concerning to Republicans in the White House. I think one of the things that we're seeing, though, is Republicans trying to really focus in on the most extreme examples. We saw that at the White House with the images of people leading up the driveway there in front of the White House. So it's clear that there is some pressure, but it doesn't seem that that is going to force them to moderate or change their position at all.
Megan Messerly, thank you so much. And Tyler Pager, appreciate it. Thank you. When Cori Bush lost her seat in the House, she said, quote, "I'm just getting started." What'd she mean by that? Well, here's part of the answer. She's teaming up with another former member of the so-called squad, House Democrats, in an effort to call Democrats to action. We'll speak with them next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. Democratic lawmakers trying different ways of protesting or gaining some sort of muscularity to the resistance, as they call it, and trying to bring visibility to those efforts as the Trump administration carries on. That's been sit-ins, calls for impeachment, very small calls for impeachment, and even lengthy speeches on the Senate floor. Well, two former members of the so-called squad, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, have a simple question for Democrats who are still maybe lost in the wilderness. That question is, will you be a show horse or a workhorse? Those two former Democratic members of Congress, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, join me now. It's great to have you with me. We'll get to the show horse, workhorse thing in a second, but here's a question I'd like to ask you both. Because I've written this down. This is notes I took after the election. Because I think these numbers, they just keep running through my head. So from 2020 to 2024, Democrats lost 400,000 votes in New Jersey, 1.9 million in California, 900,000 in New York, and 400,000 in Illinois. What do those numbers tell the two of you? And Jamal, let's start with you.
The American people are not inspired by the Democratic Party. They're not inspired by our message. They're not inspired by what we represent. And we haven't done enough to do the work to really get into communities and connect with the everyday working class American people. Listen, the majority of the American people don't even trust elected officials. They have low approval ratings of Congress overall. And so the Democratic Party has to do a lot more to make sure that we are connecting in the real way with the American people. And we failed to do that. So people are not inspired. They're not excited. They're staying home. This is from civic education in elementary school all the way through adulthood, where people are just struggling to find a job, keep a job, make good money, and pay their bills. And so it's a failure on many, many fronts.
Cory, you know why I name-checked those states. Those are blue states where the campaign was not aggressively engaged, and yet there was this pretty sizable pull-away. How do you explain it? What's your post-mortem on that?
Well, I'll co-sign what Jamal just said, and I'll add to that, Major, that, we have to be who we say we are. We have to show that and I feel like in so many areas, as we talk about being the party of human rights and the party of civil rights, and we're the ones that are fighting for you, we can't be hypocrites. And I think in so many ways we have been hypocrites when, if civil rights for some, but not for all. If we take money, we call Donald Trump a fascist, or this authoritarian regime, people call them racist. I called them racist myself. But then we turn around and we shake hands with them, or we take money from the same people that support Donald Trump and supports, other Republican members of Congress that want to strip away our rights. So you can't do both. There has to be an opposition party. And I don't believe people saw the true opposition. And then we had youth. Youth decided, like, this is not, like, I'm sitting this one out, our younger voters. And we saw a decline from 2020 to 2024, somewhere like, 15% or 14% or something decline just from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris's race, because young people were saying, hey, we believe that each and every person deserves safety and the ability to grow up. And so that's children in this country and children abroad. We deserve to make sure that our tax dollars are being used to, in our communities, that our social safety net is strong. And we were seeing that being stripped away. People want to understand that when I say I support this politician is doing exactly what they say. And I don't think that we've shown that strong enough.
Cory, I started with Jamal. I want to start with you on this one. What does this moment require of Democrats? Grassroots are in Congress. What does this moment actually require?
This moment requires everyone to, first of all, be brilliant in your area. And we can't be afraid to allow people to be brilliant in their area. So have the communicators, those messengers, speak up and deliver the message. Have the people who are the analysts, have them analyze the data and get that to the messengers. Have the fighters who are the people that are on the front lines that will do the direct action, that aren't afraid to put themselves on the line. Have those people to the front to do that work. You can't be afraid of those folks. That's what we need in this moment. Everybody doing their thing. And we can't look at, oh, you're progressive. Oh, you're this, you're that, oh, it's not your turn yet. No, it's everybody's turn right now, because everybody is being impacted, or you are about to be impacted. And so that's what this moment calls for. This moment calls for us to do also things that make us uncomfortable. You may not have ever done this particular thing before, but what will you say in 5 years when we look back and say, I could have done more? Do we want to be in that position? No. Put everything on the line right now, because the Republicans are throwing everything at the wall. They don't care if they do it right. Elon Musk is like, oh, we've made mistakes. They're just they're just railroading us. No, we have to fight with everything we have. So each and every person in this party deserves to have their voices heard and bring all of that excellence to the front.
And Jamal, same question, but filter it through the show horse, workhorse thing, and I got about 1:10.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we have to be on offense, offense, offense. We have to be consistently telling the American people the truth about Donald Trump, about J.D. Vance, about Elon Musk, about the entire administration. But we also have to finally tell the truth about ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. Look, we have screwed up. This is the Democratic Party speaking. The Democratic Party needs to admit to the American people, we have screwed up. We have been corrupted by big money in politics. And because of that big money is dictating how I show up, as opposed to me showing up for you, the working class American people. And so Congress and many elected officials and many state houses across the country, they've become theater. They become a showcase and an act for the American people and not true service. And so if we are here to serve the Constitution during this constitutional crisis, we need to be on offense, offense, offense. We need to tell the truth. We need to stop taking money from billionaires who fund the Republican Party. We need to stop supporting the forever wars as well.
Cory Bush, Jamal Bowman, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This election, I'll be voting for someone who will help protect Canada's sovereignty.
Trade wars, tariffs, and the threat of annexation, how President Trump has impacted today's Canadian election. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. As Canadians head to the polls today, President Trump giving those angry over his 51st state rhetoric more reason for concern and possibly a little bit of anger. President, in what might be described as trolling, said Canada in a new social media post, if it joined the United States, would see, quote, zero tariffs or taxes. Canadians appear highly motivated in this election. Early voting broke records, and long lines at polling places were reported today across the country. Joining us now for more on this election, Mercedes Stevenson, Ottawa Bureau Chief for Canada's Global News. Mercedes, always great to see you. When we spoke Friday, you were not really ready, according to the polls, to predict a winner. I've read a lot of things over the weekend saying that the Liberals, led by Mark Carney, are on the cusp of a victory, and they might even get a majority in Parliament. How do you read that analysis?
I think that it's accurate to say that's what the polls are showing us. The question will be whether or not that's how things show up tonight, although that particular Donald Trump social media posts that you just highlighted are likely to drive people into the Carney camp if they might have been going one way or the other. And by the way, Donald Trump has said that he actually prefers a liberal government, thinks they're easier to negotiate with. Pierre Poilievre, who is our conservative leader up here, kind of panicked when this tweet came out and immediately said President Trump needs to butt out of the Canadian election because some people thought it was a reference to Pierre Poilievre, so that could really hurt him in the polls, which is why you see him reacting. I think it's actually Donald Trump describing Donald Trump there, but it speaks to how much this election has really been about a leader who is not of our country and trying to decide who in fact should lead Canada. It's possible the Liberals get a majority tonight. It's possible they get a minority, which means the government is not as stable. That's the last one that they had. And then use the NDP, which is sort of the socialist party here, to back them up. And it's possible there's hidden conservative support like there was in the U.S. election. So a lot of people are really hedging their bets, but there's no question that the numbers that we can see that are publicly available are telling us that so far this looks like the Liberals to lose, but it is a tight race and anything could still happen.
And for those of us in America who are not familiar with the contours of Canadian elections of this kind, it feels to us very different that there's so much more conversation. There's a kind of energy in this election, not previously visible in other recent Canadian elections. Would that be true?
Absolutely. It's being called the election of a lifetime, the election of a generation. I've covered a lot of elections in my time as a political reporter. I've never seen engagement like this. It goes to both what you were talking about in terms of the over 7 million people that voted in the advanced polls. That's a lot of people when you're talking about a population the size of Canada's, to just hearing Uber drivers or front desk staff at the hotel here talking about who they voted for. I haven't seen that in past elections. So there's really a level of engagement here and a question of who's best to lead. And that comes from two places. Part of it is frustration that Canadians are experiencing with a decreasing quality of life in some cases, and certainly an increasing cost of living for everyone, but also this existential threat that is perceived from Donald Trump. And I think a lot of Americans think Canadians assume that Donald Trump is joking. They don't. This is taken very seriously in Canada. I've never seen this kind of patriotism before. The closest we've come would have been during Afghanistan, when our soldiers would come home who had died on the battlefield, and we would line the highways with Canadian flags. Even that was not this level of an almost aggressive patriotism of a country that is worried that what has traditionally been our biggest ally and friend now may be looking to annex us against our will.
Mercedes, walk us through the night. How will the returns come in, and when we might hear from a at least presumed victor?
So it'll start coming in around 7:30 when the Atlantic polls close. Atlantic Canada has swung very liberal red in the past. It was looking like it was going to go conservative, but now there are questions that it looks like it could go back to a red wave. That's not what wins elections, though. In Canada, there's some key areas that determine who will win the election. They are largely around Quebec and Montreal, in Ontario around Toronto, where I am right now, and then in the lower mainland of British Columbia, so around Vancouver. Those are really the battlegrounds you've seen politicians going to over and over. If one of the parties is able to substantially take Ontario, that's usually when the vote is called. And if it is a landslide for the Liberals, we'll know that very early in the night. And if it's not, then we could be here very late, as there are a number of really close ridings that could affect which way this gets called.
Excellent. As always, Mercedes Stevens, I appreciate it very much. Thank you, and have a very good election night.
Thank you, Major.
Tomorrow, CBS News 24/7 will have special coverage of the first 100 days of President Trump's second term. Join me for that tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report is coming up next, right here on CBS News 24/7.